Hey guys, Zil here, producer of the podcast. So with all the crazy news about the coronavirus and the developments that are still being made day by day, if you don't know, Geoff and I re-record out of San Francisco, which as of March 16th, 2020 has been designated a quarantine zone. Some things are going to change with this program. You'll still be getting episodes weekly, but you might notice some change in audio quality, video quality, whether you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or watching on YouTube. This is kind of uncharted territory. So hopefully on your end, not much will change. You'll still be getting all this great content. We are maintaining a positive outlook on this and don't want to put a sour note on these episodes, I'm currently working to get guests to help spread the best information on how to stay healthy during these trying times. Not all our upcoming episodes will be based on the virus. We have quite a backlog, but just wanted to preface that. So the show will go on. It must go on. So let's get right into it.
I'm excited to do an in-person podcast today for the Age Women podcast. I have Dr. Hayley Teasdale joining us in our San Francisco headquarters. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Your current role is the research lead of Halo Neuroscience, and we've had a couple conversations with co-founder Daniel Chow over the years. So excited to learn more about your academic background as well as the latest developments with Halo. I know that you have quite a deep background in transcranial direct stimulation beyond just the human performance space. So probably be a good entry point to start with your background. Why was this an interesting area for you to pursue as you were growing up?
There's so much to go into in that. But I want to start with proprioception, right? Because that word might not be familiar to a lot of people, but it just blows me away when I think about it. So proprioception is the sense of where your body is in space. So it's made up from, senses from your skin and muscles, your inner ear and your vision. And putting that all together helps your brain to understand what your body is doing in the world. That, to me, is endlessly fascinating, but also informs how we can then improve our performance. And I guess to summarize everything that I've done so far in my career, it's really understanding how we interpret the world around us and how we can optimize translating that into movement. And going right back, this is like what my PhD was based in. So looking at proprioception in people with Parkinson's disease. It wasn't well quantified, but people with Parkinson's disease actually lose proprioception really rapidly. This is really hard because you can imagine you lose proprioception, you don't understand where your body is in space, and this makes these people more at risk of falls and also makes it really hard to just do day-to-day activities. So my PhD was using brain stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation, combined with exercise to try and improve the physical performance and the proprioception in these people. It was really, really fascinating to see how that translated to improvements in balance. So obviously you can understand, if you understand where you are in space with proprioception, then that helps with your balance. By the end of one of the studies I did in my PhD, I had a participant not using his walking stick anymore because he'd regained so much of his balance. I had a participant who was out playing soccer on the weekend with his kids, with his grandkids, I should say. And it was just changing their whole demeanor, because they were getting so much more out of their lives now that they had their proprioception and their balance back. And then it came to the end of the study, and that was really, really hard to say, you can't come back into my laboratory, I can't give you brain stimulation and these specialized exercises anymore. For me, I just really wanted to find a way that we could help these people experience the improvements that they'd seen with brain stimulation in their own homes. It's just really closing the loop for me to be the lead scientist at Halo now, knowing that we can take something that's so powerful and important and put it into the hands of everyday people to help them improve their performance.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. And I think it's a nice closing loop in terms of translating clinical research into applications that people can buy off the shelf. But I want to also understand and dive into a little bit of your thesis work. But before that, I do want to get your experiences. Why do you want to become a scientist? What gravitated you towards neuroscience?
I've always wanted to be a scientist. Like, I was one of those kids with a toy microscope, like looking at bugs and pieces of carpet. Like, I loved science from a very young age, and that was very evident. I think I'm just a naturally curious person, always asking a lot of questions, and I love to read and I love to write. And I think people don't often think of those as things that contribute to a scientist, but they are. It's a big part of our job. And it got to university and I knew I wanted to study science. And I started taking some neuroscience subjects and I absolutely fell in love with it. And this really aligned with another part of my life. At the time, I became really unwell and I was really struggling to get through university. And I started relying on different ways of studying and different ways of taking in information and being able to translate that into, high marks at my university. I wanted to do well, but I didn't have much physical capacity to do so. At the same time, what I was studying was how to train the brain. I was studying for a degree in neuroscience. And that was when I really saw the power of what I was studying. I was able to see the application in my everyday life, and it became much more of a passion for me. I can see in real life changing my own brain.
Do you have a specific example on what learning through auditory lessons versus visual? I mean, what were some specific examples that you kind of hacked your learning capacity?
I mean, everyone is so different.
Yeah.
For me, it was determining what time of day and what sleep schedule would really elevate my capacity to study. I found out that if I woke up at 4 a.m. and started studying then, and I was in bed really early, obviously, to get up at 4 a.m. every morning, that was my peak time to study. So between 4 a.m. and 9 a.m., those were the best hours for me. Certain things like eating really well, but also then the actual techniques of studying. So I would experiment listening to my lectures 7 or 8 times because I found that I had trouble, actually remembering the little pieces from those lectures that might be important, different ways of taking notes and refining notes. And this is, I might have seemed like I've gone a bit far here, but I would cover an entire wall and connect the dots because a lot of what I was studying was the brain and anatomy. And I was able to relate how different parts of the brain connected with one another across a whole wall. So it kind of looked like one of those conspiracy theory maps by the end. But, I was
the beautiful mind, just like the giant conspiracy walls and lines.
But being so physical with the information and really being able to track how my thought process was going was really useful for me. So the whole thing was a giant experiment, but I got the degree, so I'd say it was a successful experiment.
I think it's cool because I think it's very self-aware, and I think more people should be more thoughtful around the meta process of learning, right? People learn the subject at hand, but learning about how you best learn is probably even higher leverage, higher order.
Totally, and everyone learns so differently. And I don't think we can all just do the same university course and study in the same way and expect the same results. That's not how it works. So I learned a lot about myself.
One of our main topics on this podcast is talking about nutrition, and nutrition is so personalized based on your genetic baseline versus also your goals and what outcomes you're trying to target. And it's obvious that nutrition should be personalized. I think the notion of personalized medicine is becoming more and more mainstream, or that should be the future of medicine. So taking it to learning seems obvious that we should be learning in different bespoke ways fit for ourselves. And I think that segues nicely to proprioception because there's this meta self-awareness around how you learn, but also the self-awareness of how you perceive the location of your body or the movement of your body with beyond just your sight. And we were talking about this a little bit before going live here around me feeling a lot more personally attuned to that because I've been doing a lot of Olympic powerlifting training and be much more aware of body weight, what your body positioning is. I've also been doing a lot of calisthenics. Definitely some practice or some art to that. And in reflection of how I perceive my body previously, my sense is that in modern civilization, modern culture, we're very unaware of our body positioning now. I think if you look at the average person walking around, you're always hunched, bent over, and you're always seated. And there's no evolutionary drive to be aware of your body. We're not going to get hunted down by an animal, or you don't need to be really self-aware with your environment or your own body position. This is a topic that I think more people should be more thoughtful about. Obviously, there's applications for therapeutic use cases like Parkinson's. I'm just curious to open up the discussion topic around why is it valuable to have better proprioception? Are people generally decreasing over time? Has our entire cohort of our current civilization decreased in our awareness beyond other previous generations?
Yeah, I mean, that's opened up a really interesting question for me that I've never really considered before. is, how is proprioception changing over time in people? So not just across the lifespan, which we know we have quantified how it's changing over time, but between generations. It's just made me think of, even the process of wearing shoes. Barefoot walking provides so much sensory feedback to your feet, but we wear shoes now, and we wear shoes all the time. I personally hate going places barefoot. So how is that changing how our proprioception is being used over time? Want to have more answers to that. We just haven't been measuring proprioception for long enough to know the difference. But I think, so some of the measures that we use for proprioception, we basically take away vision. So getting people to close their eyes or they're blindfolded and reporting back on either mechanical tests or kind of like more of a observational test to see if people can match joint positions. So move your foot to here, close your eyes, can you move it to that spot again? Seeing how accurate people are. And these are the kind of tests that we've been using, and we've been developing them, quantifying them. I think we have a much better understanding now of how to measure proprioception, that I would love to see us track that over time as people change in their habits.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how we can go backwards though.
Yeah, I think it's lost data.
Yeah, I mean, as a scientist, I always feel like we could have gathered more data.
Yeah.
This is definitely one of those times.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely interesting things around generational cohorts, even just for like metabolic panels for blood markers today. When you get the range of, this is a healthy normal of, LDL or, C-reactive protein. What are these benchmarks based on? Well, they're based on 25 to 75 percentile of the general American population, or a standard population that the lab tests. Mm-hmm. And one could make the argument that that benchmark is based on a metabolically unhealthy cohort, because 2/3 of Americans are already overweight, going towards obese, and 1/3 of Americans are already pre-diabetic, diabetic. So are these biomarkers that we're benchmarking our lab results to even good things to measure against, right? And I think it's like we don't have data on the prehistoric human who was running around hunting and gathering.
Yeah.
That could look very different from modern humans. So that's just like one, I think it's like a very similar, argument around lost data. And I think something that's been interesting recently that I've been looking a little bit at is that the generational decrease in testosterone in men. So on average, men our generation have lower testosterone than their fathers and their grandfathers, and it's unexplained why that's happening. So I wouldn't be surprised if our proprioception, again, no data, it's complete speculation, has decremented because no one cares, no one practices it anymore.
Especially as more processes become automated.
Yeah.
We're doing less things manually than we have done in the past. We're even maybe cooking less. We're, everyday tasks that, actually are training our proprioception without us, consciously training proprioception.
Yeah.
That we might be starting to lose it. I'm really interested in this. You've got me thinking it's going to bug me all night now. I think I'm going to be reading about this.
Good. Yeah, let us know.
Research into it.
I mean, so I know that sometimes the action itself drives learning. So, like, for example, if you smile, you drive the emotion of being happy, right? That's an interesting result. I just wonder, is there data suggesting that, it sounds like as you suffer through Parkinson's, you lose proprioception. Is there an inverse effect where if you train, and it sounds like you have some data where you can prevent the decrements of proprioception loss, does training some of these functions improve performance across other cognitive domains? I
mean, it all comes back to neuroplasticity. So we're really relying on the brain's ability to change, so that when we're training someone to try and improve their proprioception, they have the ability to do so because their brain is able to change. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's difficult. So with Parkinson's disease, we can't actually change the progression of the disease itself. But the brain is so remarkable because even if that part of the brain is unable to be used, the neurons have been lost. We can reroute around that. And that's what we're doing, is kind of forcing the brain to think, okay, what's another pathway I could use to get this job done? And that job is sensing where the body is in space. So in that way, we can give something back to a person that they might have lost without, unfortunately, changing the progression of the Parkinson's disease itself, which is a whole nother kettle of fish that, it's another challenge for us. But this translates a lot to anyone that wants to improve their proprioception. So really, a healthy brain has a bit of a head start. I mean, we all lose our proprioception over time. Adulthood is probably where we're at our peak, somewhere between teenage years and, our 40s. But over time, we start to lose our proprioception, and we all have the ability to train it and improve it. And I think that's just beautiful.
Yeah.
Thanks, brain.
Are you doing anything specifically to train proprioception at this point? I know there's been some work around cognitive training, and we can maybe open up that can of worms. But yeah, curious in terms of proprioception training. And what does that look like? Is that something reasonable?
I mean, absolutely. There's obviously being so passionate about proprioception, I've brought a bit of that to my job at Halo.
Yeah.
So we're in talks with the Australian Institute of Sport at the moment, the University of Canberra, at looking at injury rehabilitation for high-level athletes. It's incredible that proprioception can actually be a predictor of injury and also a predictor of whether a person will go professional or go pro. So there's a lot we can learn from proprioception, which shows how important it is that we rehabilitate it after an injury. We find that a lot of athletes might seem to be at the level in injury rehabilitation where they're ready to re-enter the sport. But on a neurological level, that rehabilitation is not complete. So there's definitely more we can do. And for us, it looks like we can train proprioception, and maybe that can add some benefit to the athlete. So that's something that we're really interested in, bringing in the element of brain stimulation, boosting neuroplasticity, combining that with proprioceptive training, and seeing how it helps with injury rehabilitation in high-level athletes. So we're talking about basketball players in this example.
Got it. And I brought up cognitive training because there's been some conflicting results in that specific domains, where these sort of brain training games actually translate across broader, more general tasks, right? Like if you're playing a game that, how many numbers can you remember? Working span memory tests. Does that actually translate to broader, higher level cognitive tasks? Is there more research or more conclusiveness there?
I think we're definitely not as far along in the cognitive space as we are in the motor space. Yeah. But that's exciting to me because there's so many questions that I think have the potential to be answered. Yeah. We've seen some interesting results with a different type of brain stimulation, transcranial alternating current stimulation. So this is a bit different to what our product, the Halo Sport, does with transcranial direct current stimulation. It has shown some interesting results in older adults with, cognitive deficit, problems with their working memory, and that so alternating current, it works on the different brain waves. So there's synchrony of waves in your brain, and it shows that if you can help to synchronize those brain waves again, that it can get the working memory of older adults back to the working memory of a young adult, right? Which is fascinating because that result says, we can reverse brain aging, right? Which is super exciting, but it's one of the first studies to show that. So I think there's a lot more to be done in replicating those results, figuring out what that means, figuring out what does that tell us about the brain, and how can other types of brain stimulation like TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, be able to have a say here? How can we use that to help?
Yeah, no, I think it's a perfect segue. Let's talk about brain stimulation as a category broadly. So I think you already referred to a couple different types. There's the direct current, there's alternating current, and folks who maybe remember from Edison and Tesla, these are kind of forms of transmitting electricity. But now in this case, we're applying these kinds of different types of currents to the brain. How would you just segment and categorize and make a taxonomy for the space? I mean, okay, there's a lot of things you can do to stimulate the brain. Electricity is one obvious, one direct way to do this. Or have people looked at, acoustic stimulation? I'm sure there's people have tried all sorts of stuff. What does the universe look like here?
It's a wide and complex universe. And I think, using techniques like electricity, which is the language the brain is already speaking, and all these other types of brain stimulation are really attractive because we seem to have less side effects than we do with some types of medications and other ways that we can treat disorders. So the idea of being able to treat something non-invasively and, safely that's the dream. So we're seeing a lot of different types of stimulation popping up. I guess the biggest two areas would be invasive and non-invasive. So we're talking about invasive, implants that are inside the brain that require neurosurgery. Things like deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease would fall into that category. And non-invasive, so things that sit on top of the head, not breaking the skin, I would say, is non-invasive. So you've got things like TMS, like transcranial magnetic stimulation. You've got your TDCS, TACS. I don't mean to just throw a bunch of acronyms at you, but so we've got, electricity, magnetic.
Would love to dive in there, so I'm sure throw out the acronyms. We'll
there's
break it
also
down.
vagal nerve stimulation. You could go outside the head and look at something I'm really interested in, which is haptic feedback. So how can we deliver sensations to other parts of the body to help trigger our senses and in that way trigger certain areas of the brain?
Give some concrete examples for people. Elon Musk has a thing called Neuralink, which would be considered an invasive implant. I'd like to ask my understanding of what they're contemplating. My understanding is that's an invasive. They're going to implant electrodes directly into the brain.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with it at this stage. Again, a lot of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
From what I can understand is there's a lot of people investigating how we can connect brains with computers, these brain-computer interfaces. How can we close the loop? How can we take information from the brain and stimulate it based on what the brain is already telling us? And I think that closing the loop is that next step where I think we're not too far off doing it properly, and that's really exciting.
Yeah. So going to like the non-invasive stuff, so really above, so outside the skin or outside the cranium, outside the bone, which is probably like one way to think about it. So I think you mentioned a good point around electricity is kind of the way the brain already communicates, right? So I think in our last conversation with Dr. Dan Chow, we're talking a little bit about action potentials and how that's triggered. So I think it would be nice to kind of review why is electricity the language of the brain already? Mm-hmm. We'll start there, and also let's talk about a little bit of the magnetics and the other ways to stimulate the brain.
Yeah, sure. So at a single cell level, a single neuron level, a single neuron receives so much information from thousands upon thousands of other neurons, and some of the information will be, negative and some will be positive. And I like to think of it as peer pressure. If it gets enough information to say it should fire, it will. And when it fires, that's actually a firing of electric current, right? So it's reaching a threshold and it fires.
Yeah.
And when...
So it's kind of like you need enough activation energy, and it kind of jumps around, and once it goes across the threshold, boom, you get the spike.
Yep. And that's the fire. And then basically, so that will fire, and then it'll pass a message to the next neuron.
Yep.
So what we want to see is neurons firing in synchrony and forming pathways. So this could be a neuron firing from your big toe, making it all its way up to the spine into the brain, and that's how we receive a message. Yep. Lots of neurons firing in a row. So that's what's happening on a cellular level.
I think let's define how neurons work and review that, and then build into how the simulation side works.
Yeah, sure.
Right, because there's the electrical component of neurons, but also the neurotransmitters, right? I think people are familiar with serotonin and dopamine. How do these two systems work together here?
Yeah, so the neurotransmitters are what's happening between the neurons. Yeah. So when a neuron fires, there's this little gap between the neurons, and the neurotransmitters are released into that gap. They bind to the next neuron, and they're the messages that are saying yes or no, the positive or negative. So once they bind to the next neuron, it's a cascade of events which, adds up to a yes, I'll fire, or a no, I won't fire. And so that's how the neurotransmitters fit into the whole equation. They're super important, endlessly complex, and we're still learning so much about so many different types of neurotransmitters. What I find really interesting is that with brain stimulation, you aren't introducing anything different. We're not introducing something that could have a negative impact on a different part of the body, or, we're delivering a mild, with TDCS in particular, a mild electric current that's actually not enough to make those neurons hit the threshold and fire and spike, but charge them up so that they are just below the threshold, ready to go. So what I love about that is it's on you. What do you want to improve?
Yeah.
It's up to you to make those neurons fire. And I love that about it because, it really puts it on you to make that choice.
So that leads just the kind of the devil's advocate question, which is that, okay, we're either lowering the threshold or increasing, basically reducing the amount of yeses needed to fire the neuron. So then it becomes a target selection problem, right? Like you want the right neurons to potentially have a lower threshold to fire.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
Because if you have everything firing in, it's pure chaos too, right? So it's like,
for sure.
So what is the balance there? What is the kind of the nuances in terms of, okay, it seems reasonable that okay, well, I guess part one, like why is it even a good idea to reduce the action potential or the threshold? And then two, how do you balance between overstimulation and understimulation?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it's really important to make sure that the right neurons are firing, but that's why TDCS is a really good candidate for this, is that it's not making everything fire under the brain, under the area of the brain that the stimulator is sitting on. So, I mean, that for me is, if you're heading into training, you want to do the best possible training, the cleanest reps using the exact skill that you want to get better at. If you're an athlete, a lot of our users are musicians, so maybe you're playing a musical instrument, so you want to be doing exactly what you want to improve. By making those neurons fire, reducing the threshold so it's easier for the right neurons to fire when you're doing the right activity. The more you can make them fire, the more they will be built into your memory. You'll gain muscle memory, and that's how that pathway works. So I guess it really is with TDCS really safe because it's still on you to make them fire. They're not going to fire on their own unless you're doing an activity to make them fire.
Yeah.
That's different for different types of brain stimulation. So things like TMS do have the ability to make neurons fire. And that's why TMS, there's a lot more FDA-approved treatment for a lot of conditions, but it is done in a laboratory or a medical clinic where there is a lot of tracking to make sure that we're getting the right area, because it's really important when you're actually making the neurons fire, forcing them to fire, that we're making sure that the right neurons are firing.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So your distinction there is that the TDCS, you still requires the user to do the clean reps to trigger the firing of the neurons, and hopefully that builds up some sort of more durable connection that will trigger more again easily down the line.
For sure. I mean, you might look really good if you use a Halo Sport sitting on the couch, but if you really want to see results, you have to do the work as well. So it's there to prime you to do the best possible training. But you have to do the training.
Right. And it's almost extra important to make sure the training is done really well, because then the downside is if you train improperly while primed, then you actually double down on learning bad technique. Would that be correct? I
mean, it's totally correct, but it's the same with any form of training. I mean, you can easily train the wrong technique. What we love about Halo is it helps you train faster. If you're training the wrong technique, you'll learn it, you'll do it fast, and if you need to change it or adjust your technique, you can do it faster. So there is some room for error.
Yeah, and I think that's like the right nuance, right? Because I think it's like, okay, you're reducing the threshold, so you're gonna be firing these neurons more quickly, more readily. You're gonna be building up these longer chains more readily. So for users, make sure to have really, really clean reps then, and like clean technique. Otherwise, you're like backfiring on like the whole point of doing all this training.
Yeah, but you know what? I kind of love that because, it's really forcing people to be really conscious with their training, you should be doing that anyway, right? You should be trying to keep the best form you can.
Again, I think everyone goes through this cycle where you just want to like throw up number of reps or like number of pounds or whatever, just kind of like hit numbers. And as you get a little bit more experience and wise, it's all about cleanliness of technique. That's just much more useful. Yeah,
and I mean, if you're using the right technique and you're training the right technique, and reinforcing those pathways, you'll still see gains in strength and endurance because you are using the right technique, which means you're using less energy. It's more efficient.
The brain is known to be super plastic. I'm curious in terms of the latest literature and your understanding there. How does neuroplasticity evolve over time? I mean, can you keep rebuilding, repaving these neural pathways ad infinitum? Is there some sort of natural limit where it's like you've learned 17 things, it's like harder for your neurons to adapt to the 18th iteration? What is the latest literature there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think of it, but I think too often when we think of neuroplasticity, we think about acquiring new things, because that's what we care about, is acquiring new things. The other half of neuroplasticity is forgetting things. So your brain is changing to get rid of all the stuff it doesn't need, and that's happening constantly. That's why you can't do a cartwheel and it's just as good as you did when you were a kid. It's because you haven't done a cartwheel in a very long time. Without reinforcing those pathways in the brain, your brain will naturally trim them because it needs to use up all of that space that it has for what's important to you at that point in time. So I think it really comes down to training, what's important to you. You have a lot of landscape in the brain to learn almost an infinite number of things. Yeah. But if you don't keep reinforcing those things, you will lose them. So I think it's important to think about loss in that context.
And then diving a little bit deeper into the physics of how TDCS works, I'm curious in terms of how you guys think about the amount of current you pass through. How do you know, the number to, get through the skull? You want to, reduce the threshold by some level. Mm-hmm. Have you guys quantified percentage-wise how much you're reducing the threshold? What is optimum in terms of a threshold reduction? How much is that quantified?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm still working on to this day. Yeah. This is exactly what we're working on at the moment, is really quantifying how much electricity is getting to the brain and what impact that's having. I think that it's still a moving beast. We're still trying to quantify it. A lot of the earlier research, so, there's 20 years of transcranial direct current stimulation research that's happened before now. So it's not just us that is doing this. But a lot of the early research was focused on behavioral outcomes. So, stimulating a brain and seeing how it affects the person's performance. Yeah. What we're really trying to focus on now is measuring the brain itself, the brain activity, and seeing how that differs in different stimulation conditions, to see if we can optimize exactly how much electricity we need to get through the brain, how much is getting through, right. And how we can best combine that with activity to see improvements in performance. Yeah. So it's been quantified to the point that we know that it's really safe, that we understand how much electricity should be getting to the brain, and that's why we've built in the levels of stimulation into our headset that we have. Yeah. But I think there's heaps more to learn about how we can optimize that and personalize it, because everyone's different. Yeah. We have different head shapes. Maybe our skulls are a little bit different in thickness. Our hair's a bit different. There's a lot of factors which, that's just on the outside. Like, how different are our brains? Right.
Is your motor cortex a couple millimeters off from where my motor cortex is? I mean,
and
is there that kind of variance?
For sure. And, I'll show you on the headset, but the primer band that we have is wide enough to allow for a margin of error. Yeah. So, everyone's motor cortex is slightly different, but we should cover basically everyone with this type of primer band or this electrode width. Yeah. Because we know that everyone's different. But wouldn't it be great if we could personalize it beyond that?
Yeah.
I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. That's the ultimate iteration of this. Again, we're talking a little about personalized medicine or personalized nutrition. You'd want personalized stimulation on exact parts of your brain that you'd want stimulated.
Yeah. And, it does come back to self-awareness, like we were talking about with proprioception. Sometimes you don't know what area of your brain you might need stimulated. Yeah. How are we self-aware? How do we know if our proprioception might need some work? Yeah. Or maybe we need a certain type of cognitive stimulation to get a boost. So I feel like there's a lot of room to help people become more self-aware with brain stimulation. What do you actually need to improve?
Yeah. That brings up an interesting, a side route here, because obviously the main focus of the Halo set is focused on the motor cortex, but obviously there's other parts of the brain that you might want to stimulate, the visual cortex. I mean, have people experimented? Do you have anecdotes around people trying to stimulate different parts of their brain? Have people try to stimulate their visual cortex? Do people claim that they're maybe seeing more acutely? Is that even reasonable?
The visual cortex isn't a common goal for people to stimulate. Yeah. A really popular area is the frontal region for a lot of cognitive applications, but also sensory processing in the frontal region of the brain. We're also seeing some really interesting research in the parietal cortex. So if you go above your ears and just a little bit backwards, so kind of just on the like horns of your head.
Yeah.
The parietal cortex could have some really interesting applications for cognitive things, but also for focus and, that kind of drive. And we're really interested in that. Well, I'm really interested in that because I think that that's something that a lot of people want to improve on. I know I want to improve on my focus.
Right.
I mean, I'm so easily distracted.
Yeah.
And as you know, I'm a very self-aware person and always looking to improve.
Right.
Yeah,
interesting. And I know that there's also just the cortex is kind of the most outer layer of the brain, but there's also like deeper, I guess, more brainstem stimulation. I mean, then I think the question is like, is the current going deep enough to stimulate some of the more inner structure of the brain? Mm-hmm. Have people looked at just trying to go that far deep into the brain? My understanding is that a lot of the sort of external stimulation is more focused on the surface neurons of the brain.
Yeah. So transcranial direct current stimulation is definitely focused on the outer layers of the cortex. Yeah. But, our brain is so interconnected. We kind of see it as stimulating one part of a very complex circuit. Mm-hmm. So we can't rule out influencing those, deeper regions of the brain with stimulating just the outside. Yeah. To have a more direct effect on those deeper regions, we really do look to invasive forms of brain stimulation. So that's where if we want to reach the basal ganglia, we need to perform neurosurgery and implant the electrodes inside the brain. So it does get really tricky when we're trying to go deeper.
Right.
What I find really interesting is the potential in combining different therapies. So there's been a bit of research around, can we combine brain stimulation, cognitive training, and physical exercise to kind of, exercise the brain as a whole to see some improvements in cognition. So exercise can help us with some of those internal regions of the brain. Our brain stimulation can help with some of the outer layers of the cortex. And in combination, maybe we could see some really interesting improvements in cognition.
Yeah.
That's got me interested.
That's just much more ecological, right? I think in real world, you have an ensemble of approaches. No one's ever going to just do one thing and be like, okay, this is my silver bullet. Everyone's always trying to you incorporate everything together. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we've spent a lot of time on the direct current. I'm curious in terms of whether it's in your research or at Halo, where were the other sort of pros and cons? I'm sure you guys looked at other techniques like alternating current, magnetic stimulation. What led you to focus on the TDCS as a preferred method? Was it just the body of existing literature plus your internal research? What were some of the factors there?
Yeah, I mean, safety is a really big factor. Safety and efficacy. So, making sure we have something that works. Yeah. The strongest literature for that is TDCS, over 4,000 research papers that have been published in TDCS. This recent paper that I spoke about earlier, the working memory paper with alternating current, is one of the first really strong results that we've seen. And I think that we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that space as it expands. TMS is, like the magnetic stimulation, is brilliant. It's so effective for so many conditions, but it's expensive. It's only available in the clinic. As I said, you really need to make sure that we're stimulating the right areas. Yeah. One of the members of our scientific advisory board, Nolan Williams, he's the director of the brain stimulation lab at Stanford. He's done some fascinating research into using TMS to treat depression, and that is brilliant. I guess what we're really focused on at Halo is bringing technology to people that they can use in their own homes. Yeah. At the moment, TMS is not able to be used in the home. So
how come? It's just you need giant magnets, or it's just like it's like an MRI machine essentially?
It's really big. Obviously, like I said, we're trying very carefully to get the right spot. So there's normally a big arm that's used to hold the device to make sure it's still and we're getting the right spot. Quite often, a clinician will do an MRI or some kind of structural scan. Yeah. To make sure they're targeting the right region. Like you said, maybe the motor cortex is a bit further back in that person or forwards, whatever it is, it might be a couple of centimeters. But it actually does make an impact in TMS. TDCS, we have a little bit more room to try and cover that whole region.
Got it. Yeah, I think some of the depression work is pretty promising. I know that in some of the conversations that I've had with folks in the defense military community have talked about some of the exciting early results in PTSD-like conditions as well. So that when you mentioned depression, I think it definitely kind of makes sense in terms of maybe some like cross translatability there. And then you also mentioned vagal nerve stimulation. We haven't really explored that topic a lot. It definitely comes up with, I would say, within the biohacking human performance community, where people talk about vagal nerve stimulation. What is that, and what is the data there? It just definitely seems to be more on the speculative side, given my very, cursory understanding of the space, where people have made claims around anxiety or stimulating mood with vagal nerve stimulation. What do you make of it?
So it's not my specialty, that's for sure. But and it's, I think, one of the more emerging techniques. So like I said, the idea of stimulating nerves or stimulating the brain is super attractive. So I can understand why there's so much varied research happening. And yeah, there are some interesting applications. But I'm not familiar enough with them, I don't think, to speak to it.
Okay. Yeah, I think Zilla just reminded me. I believe this was vagal nerve stimulation to trigger the inner ear to create the perception of movement. And they had some data or claims around increasing weight loss, which was kind of an interesting application of a brain stimulation technique or a nerve stimulation technique.
I'll definitely have to check it out.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear some of the latest results or projects you're working on with at Halo. I know that obviously a lot of the initial audience were athletes, potentially folks in the defense military community. What's the latest updates there? Any exciting news? Man,
there's so much exciting stuff going on. So we've spoken a lot about physical performance and athletes, which is super exciting. And, a lot of people might know us from some of our big partnerships that we have with, NBA, MLB, golfers on the PGA Tour, things like that. But what I am finding really interesting at the moment is around 20% of Halo users are musicians. So we're working with the Berklee College of Music to kind of dig deeper into the kind of effects that brain stimulation can have on a musician. One part of that that's really fascinated me was this idea that brain stimulation could foster creativity, boost the amount of songs you could write in a week. It's not just about fine motor movement. I think there's a lot of other really interesting parts of that I'm really interested to explore with Berklee. So I'm really excited about that collaboration.
Yeah, interesting. So it makes sense that the fine motor skills make sense, right? That's very, I think, natural from thinking about the motor cortex. But you're thinking that this could actually potentially boost creativity. So I imagine that's not necessarily going to be triggering the motor cortex. You're probably targeting other parts of the brain then, perhaps.
Well, we see that as a flow-on effect from stimulating the motor cortex. But this is a very early observation and something that we want to look into and really determine where's the best place to stimulate. How can we best see those results? And how do you measure creativity, right? It's complex.
Maybe to just explore that a little bit more. I think they're like reaction time, working memory, high-risk decision-making, these are quite measurable. But if you were to speculate or come up with a notion to measure creativity, I'm sure people have been trying to do this. What are the best efforts to define a quantitative measure for creativity? Are there a few broad approaches that people have been trying to demonstrate?
I'm not sure I could recap them for you in great detail. Yeah. In this particular experiment, we were really looking at songwriting capacity and how that was influenced during this stimulation. And that's what we were using as a measure of creativity in that experiment. But, that was a really surprising result. And now it's time to dig deeper.
Interesting. Are you guys going to write a paper out of that, or is it going to be kind of a internal white paper?
We will once we gather more data.
Okay.
So, really understanding the mechanisms there, I think, is important before we publish. It's just something we get a lot of interesting little findings, and then it just leads to my job, which is digging deeper, spending several months gathering data and analyzing it to see what's actually happening.
So athletic performance was kind of your initial focus, and sounds like music is this surprising but promising use case. If music is there, you can imagine art, painting, a number of creative aspects. Anything else that you've heard from your community or you're particularly excited about, given that interesting nugget of new information?
I mean, it really blows me away, the diversity of the reasons that people pick up a Halo sport, right? It's anything that you want to improve your motor skills, it could potentially have an application in, right? Yeah. I think the idea of drawing or painting is really interesting to me, particularly if there is some point of creativity, but just the fine motor skills. A lot of my work in proprioception, I was also stimulating the motor cortex. So, even understanding where your hand is in space, could that be stimulated with this type of stimulation? Maybe. There's a lot of questions in that I'd really like to dig into in our research. What I find is just so many people, it's their New Year's resolution. It's normally either to learn a language or to learn an instrument. Yeah. It's normally on the list somewhere. And yeah, if we can help people learn an instrument faster, it's pretty awesome. I mean,
it sounds like there's a myriad of applications. Are there things that you wouldn't recommend people try brain stimulation for in terms of acquiring new skill? Or is really the literature and the possibilities, everything could be boosted in terms of brain stimulation at this point? I
mean, I see the door is open.
Okay.
I feel like we don't know all of the applications yet. I think it's really important to reiterate that the Halo Sport device is not approved for use in medical conditions at this point.
Right.
So, the work in brain stimulation in conditions like Parkinson's disease and stroke, those things are still very much in the laboratory. Complete that research and see what potential applications there might be. So that's probably the biggest thing I'd say not to use it for. But in terms of improving motor skill, have at. Yeah. The sky's the limit.
Yeah.
What I'm really, a weird one might be enunciation or using the muscles in your mouth in different ways. So maybe you want to learn to whistle. How could we help with that? I don't know.
Learn accents, right? It'd be cool to just drop an Australian accent right now.
Right. Maybe I need to do it to help tune my American accent now that I'm living in San Francisco.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that we were talking actually a little bit before going live. It was this notion between therapeutic or medical use versus what I think is just a growing category, which is that you want to improve healthy performance. You want to optimize. You want to be the best version of yourself. The early ways I was thinking about the space, some 5-6 years ago, was that we're all on the spectrum of performance, right? Some of us are deficient in some areas, and there are clearly people that are super normal in certain areas, and we're all just trying to be more along the spectrum towards the positive direction. Again, this is not talking about any specific product or technology, but do you just see that this line being more and more blurry in the future, where who defines even deficient or normal or super normal, right? Because it's arguable that LeBron James should be the normal human, and all of us are deficient. Obviously that's an extreme statement, but one could try to posit that as the norm.
I kind of like to see it in the opposite kind of view, which is that we know more now about the power of our brains than we ever have. In my view, literally everyone is super normal, and I think that we can just use our brains better all the time. I hate to think of anyone as deficient, because even with, 80% of your brain tissue is dying, your brain will still try and reroute around the damage and try and help you function normally. It's pretty unstoppable, and I find that pretty inspiring. So we're all superhumans. Well, we could be, right?
I think, that's definitely an optimistic way to look at it, right? Yeah, it is interesting. No, but I think that's definitely a much more positive way to look at it, which is that we all have potentially some hidden superpower. It just, I guess, some people's natural talents are more efficient at being economically productive or entertainment productive or sport productive.
Yeah.
Right.
Going back to the kind of blood testing you were talking about earlier, a lot of our standards are set on a very specific type of person that isn't generalizable to the population. Most of them actually set on males.
Yeah.
So, understanding what is a normal female meant to look like, right? Or perform like, that's, we actually don't have data on that because so many experiments have been done on males only in one particular region of the world, which doesn't necessarily extrapolate to the rest of the world.
Mainly white men.
Yeah, didn't want to say it, but yeah.
I mean, it's just a fact, right? It's like it's
mostly white men that are normally pretty well off, and that doesn't apply to everyone.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting to me is really understanding what a healthy, genuinely healthy person looks like in today's society.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting in terms of just like how do you think science and science research will look like moving forward? So I think there is interesting, just broader discussions around replicatability of a lot of research. How does industry and academia and governments and nonprofits all play together to push forward research? The notion of peer review, which is actually a relatively recent phenomenon in the history of science, where some critics of peer review call it more like peer injunction, where you can't really have like the bold ideas come out because it's actually somewhat of a competitive landscape within academia in terms of very small communities and kind of everyone knows what everyone else is working on. As someone that's come from an academic background and now in industry, what do you make of the reality, the landscape of how people are doing science now? What do you sort of make of all of it?
I mean, I think the age of, we can communicate now in ways that we've never been able to before. Yeah. So the way we're doing science now, people being able to travel across the world and share their work at conferences, publish online and everyone in the world has that article that day is very different to how science has been done in the past. And in a way, it's speeding things up. We're gaining knowledge faster. But we aren't really built for this. The academic system doesn't seem to be built for the technologies we have now. And I think now that everyone in the world, not just academics, has access to so much more information, that we need to make sure that the general population understands how to interpret the information that they're being fed by scientists and the media when the media are talking about science, right? Yeah. And I think that that's got to be a big way that we change going forward is how we work with the general population because they have access to so much information that normally, a long time ago would have been restricted to scientists in their little hidey hole labs, Yeah,
it kind of reminds me of how the dynamics of religion have evolved, right? Mm-hmm. It used to be that the priests were the only people that could read, and you would have to go through your priest to learn the word of God. Now people can read. It's like, okay, like we have a different relationship. And I think that dynamics, are happening to every institution. Yeah. Everyone can actually get the raw information, which is good, but also could be really bad. It could to your point, like if you don't have the baseline training to understand, then you have really bad interpretations or you get tricked by people.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to maintain skepticism when you really want to believe in some kind of result. Yeah. But that's something that we learn as scientists is to be skeptical, to challenge things, to test hypotheses. Yeah. That's not something the general public learns. Like that's just not what we learn, in high school or whenever it is that we learn to be skeptical. I don't know. And I think that we could all use a healthy dose of that sometimes. Yeah.
You can make the argument that the traditional schooling system is anti-skeptical, where they kind of select for characteristics of compliancy and deferring to authority, right? In some sense.
Yeah. And another thing is that when a scientific result is published that, contradicts a previous result, that is really normal in the scientific process. We learn new things and we change the way that we think about a problem, change the way we think about the world. But that can look to people as if we don't know what we're talking about. Yeah. That we're not all on the same page. And to be able to communicate that, the complexity of the scientific process, I think is really important.
But it's also, I would say that it's also describing scientists as like a monolith. Like, as you know, there's just actually different competing theories for certain cutting edge phenomenon. Yeah. So it's not even to say that there is like a science block that's just like some truth-giving entity. There is actually just a little bit of competition of ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the layman needs to understand that it's not because science is wrong. It's just that for some of the cutting edge, people are still figuring this out.
Absolutely. And we love that. That's thrilling to a scientist, but I can understand that might be scary if you didn't understand that, it's all part of the process.
Yeah. Because I think people actually appreciate the nuance. I think people don't actually appreciate being talked down towards. I think people are actually genuinely interested in some of these concepts and would rather dive into the nuance and be like, okay, what are the pros and cons? What is the positive data? What is the negative data? And let me think about it and make a decision and do my own research.
Yeah, I love allowing people to interact with the work itself or the scientists themselves. I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's just a kind of what I think Silicon Valley has done well with products, right? Like Silicon Valley has a reputation of moving pretty quickly and getting user feedback. The future of sort of any kind of innovation is just actually touching reality more and more often. And I think it's both on the layman's side as well as the scientist side, where oftentimes science ultimately touches ground with affecting people's lives.
Absolutely. I mean, I learned more from my participants with Parkinson's disease about Parkinson's disease than any scientific journal or class that I took.
Yeah.
I learned so much about how that disease operates and how it affects their life.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't have taken the time to learn that from a person who wasn't a scientist, then I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't see the importance of building things for real people. Yeah. And I totally agree. It's so important. Yeah. That, both sides have something to offer.
So obviously we talked a lot about improving performance, but one of the areas that I've become more and more interested in is rehabilitation, recovery. That seems to be actually more important for both elite performance as well as everyday people just getting injury as they age and progress through everyday life. You mentioned a little bit about the predictability of proprioception to predict recovery rates. I'm curious in terms of your application with either brain stimulation or Halo Neuroscience, the headsets. Any interesting findings, data there that could be beneficial, not on the performance side, but also on the recovery, rehabilitation side?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's something that I really want to bring to my role at Halo. At this point in time, we haven't been exploring rehabilitation in that sense, but we are starting to set up some partnerships to explore that with some external research partners. I think there's a lot to learn. There is some research out there that's already in this space. We didn't come up with the idea, but we just really want to see how that it could be used as a product. Yeah. So it's complicated and we don't have our own results. But yeah, I think it's a really exciting area that, we've got evidence from different trials using TDCS over the motor cortex in conditions like stroke, where you can really see the difference in motor rehabilitation between stimulation and no stimulation. Right. So just having that opportunity, the brain stimulator there to boost neuroplasticity, to prime the brain to learn, can be really valuable in rehabilitation. Rehabilitation can be a really long process. Changing the brain is not easy. Yeah. And people can plateau. Really, you don't see any improvement for a while, and that can be, really not encouraging at all. And you start to think, what's the point? Yeah. And that's one of the most challenging things about rehabilitation is getting people to comply and do it and make sure that we actually get to the end and that final result, which is recovery. So if we can do something that speeds up that process, we might not see as many people give up on their recovery. Yeah. I think a lot of people give up on the exercises their physical therapist gives them because, they just aren't seeing any improvement or it's taking too long or whatever that might be. If we can offer any opportunity to speed that up for people, I think it's worth exploring. Yeah.
My understanding is that some stressful or big serious injuries, your brain will get essentially a fear reaction towards going back to that similar position. So I'm just thinking, does something like TDCS kind of retrain your brain to not fear or not stay away from some of those more extreme positions where you got yourself injured in the first place for some of these chronic pain type conditions? I
mean, there's some research that's being done now in TDCS for chronic pain. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to be said for boosting neuroplasticity because those responses, those fear responses or the pain responses, they are based on, a network of neurons. And if we could change that pathway, then perhaps we wouldn't have the fear response or the pain response. What's difficult is, especially with the fear response, is that is in one of the deeper regions of the brain. So that's the amygdala.
Yeah.
Being able to reach that with this type of stimulation is tricky. Yeah. What we can do is improve skill with by stimulating the motor cortex, making sure that we're using the right techniques that could prevent further injury. But in terms of changing that fear response, that's trickier.
Yeah.
It's deeper.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. And I think that's where like the nuances of the regions you can actually target start to play into importance. Especially, I think you're talking about this sort of an ensemble approach, having multiple mechanisms, multiple interventions to drive the outcome that you want. And I think another area that I don't have a lot of experience in or expertise in, but people have been looking at hallucinogens, psilocybin, where they're starting to be approved actually for clinical research, where people are starting to override fear responses or learned behaviors in a similar way, right? I think one of the positive John Hopkins studies was using psilocybin to help people quit smoking. I think that's a very positive study. So to me, I kind of look at obviously different safety profile, different history, whole different type of baggage. But what we're talking about is essentially interventions that can change how your brain learns, and hopefully we can have a number of techniques that people can adopt.
It's all about a holistic approach to improving yourself or improving on a task. And we think that brain stimulation and neuropriming is an essential piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. I want to zoom back a little bit in terms of kind of going full circle to your Parkinson's research. One of the, I think, sad updates within, I would say, the broad pharmaceutical community around neurological conditions is that a lot of the big drug programs have failed, and a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies have pulled funding for new drug development there. I think within the nutrition, ketogenic diet community, people have been looking at nutritional interventions, and there's early data showing that ketogenic diets or exogenous ketones might be helpful for some forms of Parkinson's. I'm curious in terms of, again, going away from sort of performance consumer use case, going into more regulated medical use cases. Do you think that because these diseases are so complex, like a simple drug targets don't seem to work that well, why did you see brain stimulation be helpful in your study? Is it just because it's just more fundamentally nuanced than just targeting some neurotransmitter and hoping that drug kind of fixes the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two kind of parts to that. And, the drug pathway is so complex. Yeah. Obviously we want to make sure that a drug is safe before we're giving it to people to ingest. But within that, there's so many stages at which a drug can fail. And I think a lot of the drug failures that we're seeing, especially around medications for Parkinson's disease, are based in the fact that we still don't really understand what's causing Parkinson's disease or how it's progressing and why everyone presents so differently. Yeah. And I think without understanding, the underlying pathology, we are having a difficult time treating it with drugs. Yeah. To me, the more I learn about Parkinson's and how complex it is, that just tells me that we need something to improve quality of life for the people that have it right now. Yeah. Because in 20 years' time or 10 years' time, hopefully, we might have a medication which doesn't just address symptoms, but actually slows or stops the progression of the disease. Yeah. But we're still a long way off. Interventions like brain stimulation that can help with physical rehabilitation really, can give back to that person's well-being. And that's what it's all about. You just want to be happy and doing what you love, even if you're sick.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And it sounds like it's definitely a part of that overall outcome of the disease that I think makes a lot of sense in terms of like retraining on the physical side. One of the things I had in my notes was that you guys seem to have like a lot of exciting athlete partnerships, and I think that's been one of the coolest parts of my job with the podcast, also with our companies, like getting to work with cool athletes. Any personal favorites that you've gotten to work with? I don't know if you're personally a big sports fan. I have to admit that I'm not really a big sports fan. So like when I talk to athletes, I don't get like starshook, which might make me better at my job because it's like I just treat them as a normal person and I'm not like fanboying.
Yeah.
I'm just curious in terms of, in your current role, getting to work with elite athletes that, we all adore and cheer for. Any particular highlights that you can share? There
are some stories that I love. At the moment, one of our partners training for Tokyo 2020 is a Paralympic swimmer named Jamal Hill. I really he's, fastest in the US. He's just so driven because he understands that, he's capable of so much. His brain is capable of so much. And, I really align with him on that. And I think that he's really inspiring. I love to ski. So, being able to see some of our results for the US ski team, being able to help them reach their targets so much faster with brain stimulation is just really exciting to me. I'm terrible at skiing. I love it, but I'm terrible. So I'm like, now I've got this guy to help me.
I was going to say, there doesn't seem to be a lot of snow and mountains in Australia, right?
Well, we can blame that, but I think I'm just bad at skiing.
Any updates on the product lineup? I know that you guys, this is the second edition of the Halo set. I have the first edition back a few years ago. Anything exciting down the product roadmap? I know that you have a special offer for our podcast listeners. What can you tease in terms of the upcoming developments on the product set?
I'll try to do my best without getting in trouble. But I'll just say that, at Halo, we're really interested in other applications of this kind of technology, TDCS, particularly cognitive applications. And I think that's probably a poorly kept secret at this stage. You know how excited I am about cognitive applications. So keep an eye out for that. I'd encourage people to just follow us on social media, check out our website. I think there's some really exciting stuff coming out at Halo in the next year. And I'm so excited to be a part of it. Yeah, so where do people follow along? So there's, I'm sure you guys are on all the social handles, but where do people find you personally and where do people follow the company? Company, Halo Neuroscience on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever your poison is. You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is HeyBrains, Hay Brains. That's embarrassing, but that's what it is. Hey, it's catchy, so I'm sure we'll get some followers. But yeah, keep an eye out because, there's definitely some really interesting, stuff on the research side, and really cool partner stories that we have that we're really excited to share. And then I think we actually are partnering for a special promo here. I know that we're doing a little bit of a collab and partnership launch here. So do you want to tee off the special offer? Sure. So we're really excited to offer your listeners a discount, $75 off the Halo Sport 2. So you can use the code HVMN 2020. Yeah, definitely worth a pickup, especially if you're interested in performance, whether you're an elite athlete or someone looking to getting stronger at the gym. Definitely worth taking a look. And if that $75 helps get you over that action potential, take advantage of that. Pass that threshold. Yeah. Thanks so much for the wonderful conversation. I think it was, I appreciate going to the science and the mechanisms of actions as we build up towards technology and a product. I think our listeners appreciate just really understanding like the ABCs of all the basic terms. So appreciate you taking the time to dive in and talk about your personal research and the underpinnings behind the mechanisms here. It's been awesome. You've made me think about so many interesting things. It's been an absolute pleasure. Cool. Thanks so much. Thanks.
If you're interested to learn more about HVMN, visit www.hvmn.com/pod. Thank you for tuning in.